Well, hello, grievers. Mandy here. Restorative grief is all about creating easy access to healing, no matter where or who you are. That's why I want you to remember that if you want grief support beyond a podcast, our Patreon features monthly workbooks to accompany each episode, as well as a Discord channel for more private chats and occasional bonus content as well. Supporting this work with your finances means investing in your own wellness and the healing of others, and that in itself is an incredibly generous and restorative practice. The link to the Patreon is in the show notes, but reach out with questions, okay? Now, let's get on to this week's episode. Kimberly Dudley is a board-certified trauma recovery therapist focusing on the intersection of interpersonal neurobiology and attachment science. More simply put, she wants to teach us what we need to experience safety, security, and belonging in relationships. She's here to help us heal. We know grief threatens all three of these areas in our lives, which is why Kimberly's work in private practice and her ongoing studies in relational neurobiology are so crucial. Today, we're going to hear about her own experiences of loss and grief, what led her to this compelling intersectional work, and how a better understanding of our own attachment styles can help us heal. Hey everyone, welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. I'm your host, Mandy, and today we have the pleasure of bringing the lovely Kimberly Dudley to the podcast. She's a board-certified trauma recovery therapist and my friend, and I love her work because it is absolutely integral for us in grief work, for where we are, for who we're becoming, and her insight and her heart, the way she shows up for you and for herself is beautiful. So I'm really excited to share my friend Kimberly with you today. Welcome to the show, Kimberly.
That was so precious. Thanks, Mandy. Oh my gosh.
Absolutely.
Such a
Having
gen.
you here is going to be a gift for everyone. And so I'm really excited. And I know I just introduced you as a board certified trauma therapist, but why don't you go a little deeper with that and tell us more about who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so it's kind of a fascinating story. I do work with what we call like high acuity trauma cases. So we're talking about anyone who has pervasive history of trauma, they're going to usually come and find me. And that can mean anything from like a traumatic event that led to kind of some functioning that's uncomfortable for them to usually people usually find me are more of the kinds of people who have gone through like childhood and have had like chronic trauma is what we call that. So like repeated instances of them just not being cared for super well. And so a lot of the people that come and see me, they might even have like wonderful parents that took care of them, and it still created like a deficit in being really like nurtured and held well. And when that repeats itself over and over again, we find what's known as complex post-traumatic stress. And so I work with a lot of people with complex post-traumatic stress symptoms.
I want to quickly touch on something that you said at the end because I think it's very resonant. It is possible that as children, we had really great attentive parents and we experienced something that was deeply traumatic that we
Yes.
need support for. Can you expand that just a little bit?
Totally. Yeah. This has to do so much with that like interpersonal neurobiology thing that we're going to get into a little bit later, but it has to do with like almost like this relational pass down from our parents' story into our stories, right? And so what can happen is that we have these parents who mean well, and they might provide the clothing we need, the food we need, even some of the care that we need. And yet, in their own unknowing, they maybe didn't attune to our emotional needs the way that we needed them to. And maybe that was because they just didn't know how. And maybe because they were dealing kind of with their own stuff in the background. And so we actually see that quite a bit, like parents who meant well and just didn't know how to see their kids as like separate individuals who needed a different kind of nurturing than they were given.
There are a lot of phrases coming to mind right now that I can think of. Not that I necessarily heard, although I heard some of them growing up, but that I can like hear in TV shows and in movies of like statements like that's because I said so, or you're fine, quit crying. All of those little things that seem maybe generational or maybe like, I don't know, that don't seem necessarily traumatic. And yet We
Right.
know.
It's exactly right. In my story, the thing I heard all the time, and I'm sure you'll have lots of listeners who have heard this too, children are to be seen and not heard.
Hmm.
That was the thing that I heard all the time from my mother. Seen and not heard. Which, when you think about like what that does to a person, right? That means that I can not exist in a way that disrupts your whatever's happening for you. I can't come in if I've fallen and hurt my knee, I can't come in and disrupt your TV show. If I'm having an emotional need, I can't come to you and ask that you'll take care of me in the middle of you making dinner, because really I should be there, but not disruptive to you in any sort of way. So then I learn as an adult that my needs are really small and minimized, and actually I have to stuff those down in order to be loved well. That's how it kind of like translates through the system.
It's almost like there could be kind of a checklist or like a flow chart. Did your parents say this statement? Okay, this is what it might look like for
Yes.
you.
Yes. That is absolutely true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we talk about like, so one of the things, we kind of started talking about this a little bit, but I didn't quite get there. So I work with trauma, right? And I work with what's called interpersonal neurobiology, which is now being translated into relational neuroscience, right? And so we're actually studying what are the effects of the interpersonal, so person to person relationships, and how does that literally pass through our system that then like spreads out in our connections. So how do we perceive the world? How do we interact with the world? How do we think about ourselves? How does that influence how we then try to connect with other people around us? It's all really fascinating, and there's a reason for everything. There's a reason for the way that we are.
Yeah. Isn't it
Really.
funny? Normally, Kimberly, I freak out when someone on the show says everything happens for a reason. But I just
Yeah.
want to make it very clear. That's not actually what you said. What you said was there's a reason for everything, which that is how I like to reframe when people come to me and say, well, I believe everything happens for a reason. So there's got to be some purpose behind this. And I'm like, no, but there was something that caused it to happen. That doesn't, and it's morally neutral. It's not good or bad. It's just true.
Thank you so much for catching that, because absolutely on board with that, right?
Yeah.
We're talking more about like understanding how we are got to where we are, not that we're just gonna like bypass all the bad things and go straight for the ending.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned it a little tiny bit about what it was like for you growing up, but like, what is it that led you into such a fascinating and complex, heavy
Yeah.
field?
Yeah, yeah. I think that for many of us who practice therapy, especially for those of us who practice trauma therapy, we all come on board with a story, right? So the quickest way I can tell you the story is that someone showed up for me and it changed my life completely. And all I wanted was to be that in someone else's story.
Mm.
So I come from this really, in my way of talking about it, wild experience of both and. So on half of my family, it was really well connected. We actually like grew up in the church and we were fairly wealthy, all of these like really well connected family stories. And then the other half of my family literally came from across the tracks. So very impoverished, a very different belief system, very full of abusive structures. And so I had this like duality growing up where it was like I knew both and like something's not working here. But what's wild is that those parents swapped roles. So the parent who actually grew up in the abusive environment, he looked at his story and he's like, I won't ever repeat that. And so he did completely the opposite.
Mm.
And then my mom, who grew up in a very loving, engaged family, I'm not sure exactly what happened to her, but she actually became the abusive one in my story. And so they swapped places. And so again, I was having this experience of like huge duality where I had a mom who was very unstable and very hurtful and harmful to me. And my dad, who probably could have insulated a little bit, was a long haul truck driver. So he just like wasn't around very much. Right. And so it created this very much like, again, I can't talk about what's happening to me. I feel very small and isolated. And that's kind of the root of my story. And then that story continues to grow because of that experience. I then found a partner who, long story short, it's domestic violence. So the domestic violence was more about domestic abuse than it was violence, although I suffered both. But that became very normative because of my story of my mom, right? Like I remember thinking in the early years when things were getting really bad, like, this is just how people love me. Is that not so messed up? Like, this
Oh,
is how people love me, harming me, making me small. Yeah. So that was kind of where this started. So I was introduced to a trauma therapist and I started seeing her, and I didn't know that she was a trauma therapist. I was so disconnected from my experience. I was going because I was told to go, and I had no other like cognitive awareness from that.
Mm.
So thinking about like, how did I get here? I was thinking about this earlier. So, as someone who probably was a pretty intelligent kid, but was told to make herself small, was never able to really connect to what I knew, right? And so I had to like numb that part of me out. I couldn't know anything because it was unsafe for me to know anything. If I came with any amount of knowledge, then I, in some ways, became a threat to my mom. So I learned to shut it down. And then, pretty sure I'm an Enneagram 5.
I was just thinking that. I'm like, girl, if you didn't land on 5, I would never type you, but I have questions. Go on.
Yes. So kind of the MO of the 5 is that we also don't feel things like in our bodies, right? Like we know things, but we don't feel things. And so here I am, like, I know a lot of things, but I can't know that I know them. So I'm numbing out here and I'm already kind of like innately a little bit more numb on the feeling side. So then I get thrown into this trauma therapy and she is wonderful. She is doing the long work of like connecting to me. I mean, I've worked with her, I still work with her. I
That's
think we're
amazing.
like 16 years or something like that.
What a
Yeah.
gift.
So much so, like she
Gosh.
literally changed my life.
Yeah.
Literally changed my life. Yeah.
Oh,
So that story kind of goes on, and I'll kind of fast forward through some of that. But she invited me to do a little bit of speaking, and then I just like my brain started opening up a little bit, and I was like, huh, I think I might actually be capable of doing something. So she planted this little tiny seed, and I got to go to school and ended up having to push through school on my own while I was raising babies on my own, and was able to say like trauma therapy is what's been literally life changing for me, is the thing that I'm going to do. So that's kind of the short version of how I got into working with people who'd been traumatized, because I myself had experienced what it was like to sit with someone who was like you said, like existed in the world in such a generous, gentle way
yeah.
that I was going to mimic that. So,
I love it. What drew me to you the first time, because we met on Twitter, obviously,
yeah,
where you meet all the right people and then
right.
run away from Twitter together.
Yes.
Is my favorite thing was your like tweet that says, "One time I accidentally got married to the wrong guy, but I'm better now."
Yeah.
Like that in and of itself, I'm like, oh, people who understand the depth and the dark humor in trauma are the
Mhm.
people who can sit with us when it gets really, really messy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So
to
true.
have someone that stuck with you, that is with you for 16 years in the process, like that is so indicative of what this work actually is for, like that intersectionality that I want to talk about with neurobiology and understanding how the brain and the nervous system work with our attachment styles and how we show up for ourselves and others. Like
Yeah.
that complexity, it sounds so complex, but
Yeah.
when you recognize and you can distill it down in the way that you did, both in your silly tweet, but also in the way that you've just said, well, yeah, she showed up for me and
Mhm.
very gently said, this is what might be happening.
Right.
Invitation is so restorative. That's so healing.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I think you just named that so perfectly, right?
Yeah.
Because really that's what is at the core of those two things, interpersonal neurobiology and attachment science. It's literally just showing up. It's just saying like all parts of you are welcome with me, and you can be upset in any way that you need to be upset. You can be happy in any way that you need to be happy. And we're just going to sit here and like adore you as a human because you are good, right?
Yeah,
You exist, therefore you are good.
that's right. We've got this statement that we love to say in our house is all things can be heavy, all things can still belong. And
Yes, I like that.
I mean, obviously, my poor family deals with me on a daily basis and my intensity and like conversations that I want to have. But I think that's so necessary in this work that we both do to
Yeah.
acknowledge the heaviness belongs, not
Mhm.
because it needs to define us, not because we can't ever overcome or integrate these experiences and transform through them, but because they belong. They're part of the story, they're part of the narrative that we need to be able to understand so that we can write a different story, so that we can hear the parts that are like leading us into these areas that we don't want to be in anymore and learn how to work with them and kind of redirect our path. So I'm curious, Let's say that someone who's listened to the show has just for the first time kind of heard this language, or like is putting neurobiology and attachment together for the first time.
Yeah.
How would you recommend they start asking themselves, is this a pathway that could be helpful for me? Not all grief has trauma, right? Yet, how could these concepts of neurobiology and attachment science actually be beneficial for someone to just
Yeah.
start asking questions about?
Yeah. Yeah. It's not always safe for people to feel safe. And so the first thing I would ask anyone who's thinking about it is like, where do you soothe? Where do you feel not put on display? And what do you bring around you for that to happen? So for instance, like I self-soothe in the pool. I'm an avid swimmer. I've been doing it since I was a little, like literally a tiny baby. And so I would find myself kind of going to the pool and recognizing I could be a hot mess. I could be all kinds of spirally and swirly. And I would get in the pool and I'd go swim, 100, 140 laps, and I'd get out and I'd feel so much better. And so finding those spaces where it's like, hey, if that's the thing, like that's actually a good feeling. Like you can feel okay and soothed. And so the question of where is that for you? And can you make that acceptable? Is actually, I know that's not directly answering the question, but that's actually where we start, because we have to say, like, you are like, it's okay to not always be hurting. And it's okay also to hurt and still do the thing that you love.
Mhm.
And so finding those, like, that intersection requires us to kind of ask questions about, like, what soothes? Can we make that okay? Can we reach for that?
I think that's extremely profound. And when we recognize that we lack safety, security, and belonging in our relationships, that's where grief starts to surface, right? We don't have the language for it,
Yeah.
but we have the experiences in our bones, in our bodies, in our stories that we can say, I may not be able to say, well, I don't know if I'm safe with that person, but I will be able to say, oh, you know what? I actually feel really safe when I'm in my room with my favorite book and the candles are lit, right?
Yeah.
We have storytelling abilities to identify, and that practice
Hmm.
is, I think, really scary. So for the client or the person who's listening that just doesn't recognize a pattern of safety from their own story, right? The people who were supposed to be safe weren't safe for them. Where might they begin? So if I help them identify, or if anybody in themselves identifies, oh, I feel really soothed when I'm swimming,
Yeah.
but what do I do with that?
Mhm.
Where do I go now?
So it's a really interesting and I think complicated question, because here's the thing about neurobiology. When we talk about what you just mentioned, this feeling of unsafety, this feeling of like, I don't know how to self-soothe, that's absolutely true if you haven't ever experienced that in a human-to-human connection, right? The thing about neurobiology is that it's actually a shared experience between human to human. So Mandy, like when I sit with you and I get real quiet, and then you get real quiet, that's shared neurobiology that's happening right there in that moment. And if we look back on our past and we're like, there's no one, and this is starting to make me angry, then I start to go, okay, that's okay. Like, we don't have to actually like tell you that's the only way. We actually get to do this with animals too. They actually have a part of their brains that can co-regulate with us. So maybe you start expanding that and saying like, hey, did you have a dog? Did you have a cat? Did you ever spend time with horses? Did any of those kinds of animals ever touch this place? And so we start like opening it up and asking those questions. It doesn't have to be with humans. Humans can be really, really scary and terrifying even at times too. And the more we can give you a felt sense of wherever that may have been, you had mentioned a little bit earlier about being like alone in your room with a book and candles. Absolutely. That's where we start. Make it okay to do that. And we have to start taking away the shame to reach for those things that actually self-soothe before we can start to learn to do it in safe relationships. So there's like this, if you're working with Mandy and she's telling you to go do these things, absolutely trust into that, because those little tiny moments of like, I love to get a Starbucks on the days that I'm going to go teach. It soothes me. Okay, instead of feeling any shame about that, I'm going to like make that acceptable and start practicing that. And then in the meantime, I'm going to tell myself, this is acceptable. I can enjoy this. It's okay for me to find comfort here. And that's the way we start talking to ourselves through that process of like getting more comfortable with the idea of self-soothing too.
Yeah. We were just talking, a friend of mine and I were talking about how coming home to ourselves and belonging within ourselves and our holistic self, all the parts, is
Yeah.
such a challenging system to even start to navigate because we weren't taught how. But
Mhm.
there's also that, and I love that you said shame about it, because there's a shame in self care and in self soothing that prevents us from being able to access it. Because, like, same thing, I will get myself a latte or a cup of tea or something every time I leave therapy
Mhm.
as a ritual of like demarcating, okay, I did a very hard thing today, whether I came out crying or laughing from it, doesn't matter. I showed up for myself. There is no shame in therapy. Yes, we even have to like have that narrative still and
Right.
remind myself, yep, that's okay.
Mhm.
And what resulted and what will come tomorrow is still also okay. I'm going to sit here. But I will tell you, there are people who would be like, "Okay, cool. I'm gonna just put some shame on you for, like, stopping to get yourself a latte every time." Like, you would put money toward that $6 cup of coffee or whatever when you could just make it at home, right? That's a bad example, but there are pieces, and I want you to talk about this in the context of co-regulation because that's one of my favorite words, and you said it there. What do we do for the people who are like, "Cool, I would love to do that," but the narrative I'm bringing back, the story I'm hearing from all of these sources is working against all of the learning I'm trying to do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's so complicated, right?
Mhm.
So I'm going to answer that by telling a different story.
Yeah.
When I started kind of going through the end of my master's, all of my my master's program for my master's in clinical counseling, all of my relationships literally fell apart. So I
Mm.
actually got like divorced in the middle of my master's degree program. I left the church that I was in the middle of my master's degree program. None of the friendships that had been in my life prior to my master's program sustained after. I mean, there's a couple here and there. But I was like, what's wrong with me? Why is this happening? Right. And one of the things that my therapist again said, she said, because you are no longer that person and they no longer meet the needs because you are starting to change and grow. And so we have to be willing to let go of those voices in order to move towards who we were maybe always meant to be or who we're growing and finding out that we're actually capable of being too. And so in some ways, as you're saying that, I'm like, oh, the hard and sticky truth of that is that sometimes it's like being lost in the middle of the ocean and you're holding on to a buoy and you're just floating there. And then this, like lifeboat comes by and they're like, come grab my hand, but you have to let go of the buoy in order to grab the hand that's coming by. And I think that sometimes that experience is kind of like that. Like the
Yeah.
voices that are taking root in your mind that are actually working against your growth, why are we letting them be so loud? Because maybe they no longer belong with where you're going and what you're tracking for anymore.
Yeah.
There can be moments like in that liminal space that feel really scary or lonely. And also, when you reach for that lifeboat, when you reach towards that therapist who is showing up consistently for you, could that be a new way of thinking?
What you just described about changing all of those relationships in your own life in that period of time made me think about how our different attachment styles show up in that moment when we are gripping the buoy and we're like, "Holy oh my god, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that lifeboat looks like fun and I see you have my favorite snacks, but also this is all I've ever known." How does that person who is in that liminal space, that in between from feeling that security in relationship, even though it was maybe very tenuous or not necessarily the belonging they thought it was, or it just rather can't be the belonging that we need anymore.
I
Like you
like
said,
that. Yeah.
yeah, it was belonging. It's no longer the right kind of belonging.
Yeah.
Um, how would you invite that person to start looking at their attachment styles? Because some people can like,
Yeah.
you know, cut and run. Like, oh, okay, I've become this new person. Perfect. Bye. Bye con Dios. No hard feelings, no pain, no nothing. And the rest of us are out here like tooth and nail trying to hold on to things that no longer serve us.
Yeah. So you're talking about the difference between avoidant and anxious types of attachment?
Basically, yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
let's do that. Let's just
Yeah.
break down attachment styles a little bit and kind of talk about how that
Yeah.
plays into it.
Mhm. Yeah, it's so true. I think we don't necessarily know what our attachment style is until we go through something like that, right? And so if there is this like clinging to, we can say, oh, we might feel some of that anxiousness inside of your system. And if there's this cut and run, okay, well, definitely we're on the avoidant side of things too. But what's interesting about that is like no one belongs in either camp. It's all on a spectrum. So there may be moments where you are like, I'm going to cut it out because I'm there and I'm ready. There may be moments where you cling and you get really antsy and you just like need to hold on to the comfort item for a little bit longer, and that's okay too. One of the things that you said as you were talking about that, I was like, oh, that's the key. And I think this is why I'm going to kind of go back a little bit, why I couldn't quite answer the question of like, what do they do about the self-soothing? Because I thought, the reality is you can't do it on your own. You actually do have to search for the person or people that are going to actually like lead you through that process, which in our case is like a helpful leader, right? Like a coach, a therapist, somebody like that. So I just kind of wanted to throw that in there. But yeah, so the question of avoidant and anxious and disorganized, that's the other brand of attachment that we often look at too. So when that's happening, like that idea of like letting go and grabbing on, we can't do that until we've done the work of like starting to like pack in around us our safety. And that usually is all it takes is like one healthy relationship. And maybe that's with the therapist that you have, or maybe that's with therapist and a cat, something like that. Right? So before we move through our anxious and avoidant attachment styles, we really have to know more about ourselves. Like, what are the things that activate my system and how, and that goes all the way back to, am I okay to feel in my body, to know the difference between when I feel safe and when I feel activated. So I think the idea of like working through attachment is not that we name it and move. It's that we like get real familiar with how that affects our system and our body.
Mhm.
So I'm avoidant and my partner is anxious. And let me tell you, that has been a very fun little experiment for both of us, right? But there are wild times where we kind of like swap roles, where I become overly anxious. And we will just kind of toss in circles with that until we kind of settled in and go like, hey, what's happening inside right now? And so that's where we start. We have to get real familiar and learn that kind of the rise and fall of those experiences of emotions and feelings are like, it's safe for me to experience and process.
Mm.
We're going to get through this. I'm going to continue like keeping my eyes on my therapist as we're moving through the process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, and I'd love to hear just a little bit more about it with disorganized attachment styles.
Yeah.
As I was listening to you, I thought, gosh, I remember when I first was learning about attachment styles, I said, I'm confused by all of this. I must be disorganized because in some relationships I feel secure. In others, I feel anxious. In some, I'm avoidant. I must be disorganized. Disorganized attachment style is very different by
Yeah.
definition. It's not just someone who is a little bit scattered.
Right. That is absolutely true. And you would ask me like, how do we define those different things? It all goes back to safety. So Dr. Siegel, he is the one who kind of came up with the interpersonal neurobiology. He does this whole picture of like, how do we decide which side we land on? And I think it's absolutely fascinating. So he talks about the river of integration. I had to pause there because I call it the river of flow when I teach it. So basically he's saying like, when you're in the river of integration, you essentially feel confident, you feel competent, your brain is quiet, you feel like you can build things within yourself, you can be curious about the world around you, right? And then he says, when we start to get into our anxious or avoidant attachment styles, we will be pushed off into a bank. And on one side, you have the bank of chaos, and that's where all of the anxiety things, right? Like spinning thoughts. Um, I feel like I can't like make decisions. There's so much noise in my head. Anything that comes along with like the spiral of chaos and anxiety. Oh, okay. If I move that direction when I'm out of the river of integration and I'm on a bank, that's probably going to indicate that I had anxious attachment style. Now, the other side is the bank of rigidity. And that side is where like rules over relationship, right? Like in order to be in a relationship with me, you need to do A, B, and C, and I'm going to be really inflexible with that. And you need to follow exactly what I say when I say it. Okay, if we lean to that side, we probably have more of an avoidant type of attachment style. And that's kind of how we distill down where are we and what are we looking for. Now, here's the kicker. How do we get back into that river of integration? We have to have 4 S's. We have to be safe, seen, soothed, and have security in order for us to get back in there. And how do we do that? That's relationship. That's where we find those things. Yeah. And so that's also how we start to name for ourselves, like, how did my parents respond to me when I needed those 4 S's? So when I needed safety and security and soothing, how did my parents come in? Did I have a parent who yelled at me? Did I have a parent who sent me away? That's where we're going to find, like, what kind of attachment style do I have? And how does that play in then, again, kind of going all the way back to, how do I perceive the world? How do I interact with the world? And that's how we start to self-monitor. Oh, I think I might be on a bank right now. Oh, that might be really connected to something I experienced over and over again in my development, in my childhood years.
Wow, I could ask you so many more questions for so many hours, but we don't have that kind of time. So I think where I want to bring this in, because if my brain is firing on all cylinders with ideas and questions and curiosity about this, I imagine listeners are thinking similarly and kind of putting themselves into that river even right now.
Mhm.
And that's a lot. So
Yeah,
what if we just wrap this very brilliant conversation with a list of ideas for the person who's like, I have no idea where to soothe.
sure.
I have,
It's my favorite
um,
question.
right. Okay, good. Because I love to point out how self-care is universally accessible. It cannot be something privileged like spa days or shopping flurries. It actually deeply offends me when someone says, I had a really hard day. I'm going to do my Valley Girl voice. I had a really hard day. So I spent $400 on purses to do a little self-care. And I'm like, no, that's just indulgence and avoidance. And well, let's get judgy about it, right? All that to say,
Mhm.
what are some of your ways that you invite people who are feeling, ooh, I'm on one of these banks, I'm feeling really anxious, or I'm feeling really rigid and inflexible, and I really want to open my window of tolerance back up and get into a space where I can connect with others, connect with myself? What are some of those?
You saying that, I was like, that is why I fell in love with Mandy. I remember you posting about that, and I was like, yes, this is a friend of mine.
Yay. This is the
Yeah,
perfect, we're perfect together. Okay.
right. Okay, so you talked about what's accessible, right? And so I always say, go to the senses, right? And so senses, we're talking about, what can we taste? What can we listen to? What can we touch? What can we smell, and what can we see? That's actually how we start on our self-care. So anytime, and this is kind of like leaning back into that neurobiology piece of it, but anytime we can move our body and also be in contact with something that is beautiful to us, whether that is a soft, cozy blanket, or it's being outside, and today's kind of a windy day, like feeling the wind on your face. Anytime we can look at a beautiful flower or pick it up and smell it, and we're moving our body, that's when we're going to start integrating the self-care. So anytime you move your body from left to right, you're actually asking the information in your brain to go left to right hemisphere and to start talking to each other. And that's how we start the self-soothing. So we think about 5 senses, and we think about moving body left and right. That's how we can get into self-care. So I'm thinking about, like, let's say you have a blanket or a stuffed animal or a cat, something that you can grab and you like the sensation of, and you're rocking in a rocking chair with those things. You're starting to integrate that self-soothing self-care, and that doesn't cost anything. It's right there. You can sit on the floor and do the same thing. You can actually rock back and forth, and it'll toss that message back and forth gently in your brain about self-soothing. You can go outside, you can go for a walk, right? If you really like the outdoors, or like the sense of the feeling of the wind or the sunshine or even the rain, right, on your skin, going outside for a walk as you gently let that message pass from left to right in the steps.
That's
Yeah.
so good. Kimberly, I had my family last night. Everybody was belly down, rocking hips back and forth because we were all activated and at each other's throats and like tired but wired, right? So I said, "All right, everybody belly down. We're going to
Yeah.
do a little bit of care for our activated nervous systems because I think, self-care gets blown out of proportion as this grand big thing. And really, like you said, it is basic. It is engaging the senses. It is really just being present in that body back and forth. And there are accessible ways if our physical
Yeah.
movement is limited. If our, I love drawing people to the idea that like, hey, your brain doesn't know the difference between a
Mhm.
stick and a snake until you really get curious.
Mhm.
So what if you just visualize yourself doing that and see what
Awesome.
changes?
Mhm.
So,
Yep.
okay. I know as an Enneagram 5, you probably don't want everyone like flooding your social media and trying to build connection to you, but if they wanted to find out more about your brilliant mind and your work and just even be inspired in themselves from your quirky little smarty pants comments on Twitter, where can they find you?
redemptivegraceblog.wordpress.com
Okay.
is where I've written through some of these thoughts. So it's one of the ways I've kind of worked through my own story process too. And it's been interesting to have people find that. Actually, it seems like it's like a wealth of just information about all of these things. What does it feel like to be alone and isolated? What does it feel like to build friendships? What does it feel like to self-soothe? I mean, it's all kind of in that Redemptive Grace blog that I wrote. Yeah.
Thank you for putting your story into the world in a blog like that, because that also is not an easy thing to do. But it sure takes a lot of regulation to decide this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to journal it. I'm going to internet it. I love that. Thank you
Yeah.
too. Also, like I said, for just putting your time into today and this conversation and being willing to show up for people the way that you do. You are literally the person changing someone else's life, just like your therapist did for you.
Oh, thank you so much, Mandy. I really appreciated this opportunity. It was so sweet to
Absolutely.
spend time with you.
Thank you for listening to episode 133 of Restorative Grief. This conversation was dense and rich and full of so many wisdom nuggets that you should probably plan to return and listen again. The awareness we can build around how and why we respond the way we do in relationships is crucial to our grief stories because we need understanding and compassion for ourselves and how we show up in connection in order to see what we need to heal. If this is your first time listening to the show, thank you for joining us and making your healing a priority. Please subscribe so you can stay caught up on all the weekly episodes and leave a review if you liked what you heard. All the resources mentioned in this episode are linked in the show notes if you want more info, and if you become a patron of the show, you can access the companion workbook for this episode as well. Be sure to check out Kimberly's work and reach out to her on Twitter because she really is as lovely as she seems. And before we go, as always, one last thing. Please remember, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next week.